Good evening, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Yonit Behar and I'm the assistant curator at DePaul Art Museum. I am beyond excited to present today's program, Queer Networks in Latinx Art with Ondine Chavoya, moderated by Sam Kirk, a program in conjunction with our current exhibition, LatinXAmerican. This program has been organized in partnership with DePaul Center for Latino Research, with special thanks to Professor Billy Johnson Gonzalez. I would also like to thank DePaul's Departments of Latin American and Latino Studies and LGBTQ Studies, the Latinx Cultural Center, as well as the Warhol Foundation for Visual Arts. I was fortunate enough to see the exhibition Axis Mundo in LA a few years ago. Co-curated by Ondine Chavoya and David Evans Friends, this exhibition and its catalog have been groundbreaking for both its content and curatorial approach. I wanted to quickly read you an excerpt of the curator's essays in the catalog. Quote, Axis Mundo takes its cues from, but flips the script on exhibitions that seek to chart the circle of lesser-known artists surrounding a more lauded figure. Rather than reaffirm or reify the centrality of a well-recognized artist, as this project demonstrates, there are numerous reasons why artists are known and unknown. Axis Mundo seeks to decenter and destabilize canonical formations, end quote. Ondine Chavoya is a professor of art history and Latino studies at Williams College, where he teaches courses in contemporary art and visual culture. A specialist in Chicanx and Latinx art, Chavoya's writings have appeared in multiple publications and in numerous exhibition catalogs and edited volumes. Working with Chon Noriega, Jennifer Gonzalez, and Tere Romo, Chavoya is also co-editor of Chicano and Chicana Art, a critical anthology, which was named one of the best art books of the decade by Art News. His curatorial projects have addressed issues of collaboration, experimentation, social justice, and archival practices in contemporary art. Recent exhibitions include ASCO, Elite of the Obscure, a retrospective 1972 to 1987, Robert Rauschenberg's autobiography, and Axis Mundo, Queer Networks in Chicano L.A. The exhibition catalog for Axis Mundo garnered 9 international book awards, including a 2018 award for excellence from the Association of Art Museum Curators. Chavoya also served as the international consulting curator to the Museo de Arte de Lima, Mali, in Peru from 2018 to 2020. Our moderator tonight is Sam Kirk, who was born and raised on Chicago's South Side, earned a BFA in Interior Design from the International Academy of Design and Technology in Chicago, and an MFA in Marketing at Columbia College. Kirk's murals and public art projects can be seen all over Chicago, and she has collaborated with countless brands, including Mars Community Brewing, Grubhub, and WBEZ. Kirk's works have appeared in museums and galleries across the country, including her stained glass work at DPAM's current exhibition, LatinXAmerican, and a recent piece about transgender identity that belongs to the National Museum of Mexican Art. With that, now I will turn it over to Ondine Chavoya, who will begin with his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Yonit, and thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for sharing some time with us this evening. I'm looking forward to spending some time with you all. I wish to acknowledge that the area from which I speak to you now, currently known as Williamstown, Massachusetts, is located on Mohican land. And I also want to extend my thanks to Professor Bill Johnson Gonzalez and Museum Curator Yonit Behar for the invitation to present this evening and for organizing the event, and to artist Sam Kirk for the conversation that I'm looking forward to participating in. I'm also very grateful to previous museum leaders and curators, Julie Rodriguez-Winholm and Mia Lopez, who launched this program. While reading about the initiative and the exhibition LatinXAmerican, I was pleased to learn that, quote, the core concept of the exhibition came from a 2018 study of 18 major US art museums that showed that only 2.8% of artists in their permanent collections are Latinx, close quote. And I'm happy to share that I was a co-author. If that's what you do, turn around, bitch, I got it, you for you. Besides, you ain't got nothing better to do. War. Hi again. So I'm happy to say that I was a co-author of that interdisciplinary study that in collaboration with several colleagues in mathematics and statistics at Williams College and 2 other art historians, including Stephen Nelson. And what we found through this collaboration with, using statistical study and mathematics was perhaps not shocking, but was interesting and good to have the hard data that, that showed that most museum collections are largely white and male, right? And I was happy to see that the study has had ripple effects, including on this initiative. I'm gonna do my best to share my screen and open up a PowerPoint. Okay, and I hope that you can all see this. So as a professor, art historian, and academic, I have been involved in collaboratively developing research-driven exhibitions in areas that have not received widespread art historical and curatorial attention. For the purposes of my brief presentation this evening, I want to focus on my most recent curatorial project, Axis Mundo, Queer Networks in Chicano L.A., co-curated with David Evans France, that was launched in 2017 and that traveled through 2020 when it was presented at Kenyon College's The Gund Gallery in Ohio and went into lockdown with the initial COVID quarantine. Axis Mundo, Queer Networks in Chicano LA, maps the intersections among a network of queer Chicano and Chicana artists and their artistic collaborators from the late 1960s to the early 1990s. The exhibition takes its title in deference to the artist Mundo Meza, who we see pictured here in his self-portrait, who was renowned amongst his peers for his creativity across multiple genres, including brazen public performances in East LA with artists Gronk and Ciclona in the late 1960s, and as a painter, performer, and window dresser before his death from HIV and AIDS complications in 1985. In our conversation with artists from his generation, Mundo has always been held in high regard and spoken of with reverence for his talents. In many ways, Mundo Meza is the conceptual axis of this exhibition. And also his name, Edmundo or Mundo, which is Spanish for world, allowed us to kind of pay homage and develop Jose Esteban Munoz's idea about queer world making, right? So that the mundo making, the queer world making, that's central and a key concept that motivated this exhibition to uncover and connect the multiple players and circles in the exhibition. The mundos these artists fostered through their work pushed back against social repression, cultivating space of shared intimacy and exchange with various and intersecting cultural contexts, taking from hegemonic culture what it needed to be queerly refashioned. In this way, the artists in the exhibition explored distinct counterpublics through the presentation and distribution that was intersectional, multiplicitous, and defiant, often in the face of a racist, sexist, and homophobic mainstream culture, as well as the extreme biases of the institutional and commercial art world. And this is nothing to say of the discrimination that these artists may have also experienced within the gay community, as well as the patriarchal and homophobic attitudes that pervaded parts of the Chicano art movement. Axis Mundo grew from extensive research into the life and practices of Mundo Mesa, as well as more broadly, the work of a generation of queer Chicana and Chicano artists in Los Angeles between the late 1960s and into the early 1990s. This was an era, as you know, of tumultuous and inspiring political activism, from the emergence of the Chicano civil rights, women's and gay liberation movements, to the political activism around the AIDS epidemic. These struggles galvanized many of these artists whose work explored sexuality, community, and social identity. As research for the exhibition developed over the course of more than 4 years, my co-curator, David Evans-France, and I increasingly sought to chart the connections and affinities between numerous participants in a vibrant artistic scene that has received little exposure. And this included artists working in fashion, in performance, in punk music, and in activist circles. Axis Mundo included a diverse presentation of works by more than 50 artists and groups, showcasing how these artists experimented across a variety of media, including as painting, performance, photography, fashion, video, music, mail art, correspondence art, and lots of zines as well. Charting the networks of connections and affiliated aesthetic and conceptual practices, artists worked across shared spaces, collaborative groups, and through correspondence and exchange. Our approach to network was promiscuous and capacious. While many of the artists at the heart of the exhibition were close collaborators, not all of them worked together. Significantly, not all of the artists presented in Axis Mundo are Chicana or Chicano, nor would all of the artists identify as LGBTQ or queer. Artist networks are defined by permeability and exchange. Following the model set forth by the artists themselves, Axis Mundo is expansive, highlighting connections and coalitions across ethnic and racial heritage, as well as sexual orientation. So I'd like to share some examples that I hope will highlight the exhibition's focus on recovering under-recognized Chicana and Chicano and queer histories. And all the while, as I was putting this together, I realized I'm really going to be emphasizing the kind of photographic aspects of this. The early 1970s saw the emergence of a handful of gay Chicano and Latino organizations in Southern California. One group formed in 1972 and marched in that year's Christopher Street West Parade as the Gay Latins. Founded by Richard Reyes, they soon sought to change and update their name, wanting to use the acronym GLC in reference perhaps to the GLF, or Gay Liberation Front. The options considered were Gay Liberated Chicanos or Greater Liberated Chicanos. The group opted for the latter because the concern was that the use of the word gay in the name might discourage future membership, a decision that caused division and dissent among some members. The GLC sponsored fundraisers and social events and hosted a weekly rap session to, quote, talk about gay liberation and the Chicanos' place in gay liberation, which included both Chicanos and non-Chicanos, friends and partners. A photograph of the group that we see here shows members wearing matching t-shirts with bold lettering that reads Greater Liberated Chicano. While the group was short-lived, disbanding in 1973, at its height, the organization's mailing list included about 200 members, and individuals in Chicago, El Paso, and San Francisco had reached out about starting local chapters. The GLC's early presence in the Pride Parade and their group t-shirts find resonance with these hand-drawn t-shirts by artist Joey Terrell that read Malflora and Maricon, which are kind of Mexican Spanish slurs for dyke and fag, that would be worn by the artist Terrell, who you can see mustached kind of in the third one from my right, by artist Terrell and a group of friends marching in the 1976 Pride Parade. The back of each yellow t-shirt read role model in bold block letters. Terrell's t-shirts sought to claim space for Chicano and Chicano within an emergent queer public space. This was kind of a number of the artists and groups also utilized t-shirts at the time to signal their affiliation in both artistic and activist projects. Here I'd like to kind of pause and map out a connection with Chicago-based artist Diana Solis, where kind of similar convergences align. And these are two works that are featured in the LatinXAmerican exhibition at DePaul. Solis, as you likely know, is a veterana, pioneering artist who began exhibiting her work in 1976. And what's so, for me, moving about these types of images and what they document is literally the movement within the movements, right? And kind of claiming and occupying and mobilizing of space on the ground level. So there's parallel and resonance there to think about between these artists and these activities that they're engaged in participating in and in documenting. And also with this emphasis on the t-shirt, I kind of want to take another pause to connect the recurrence of the t-shirt as an artistic and as an activist form to something I was delighted to read about in terms of your work, Sam. And as Sam Kirk conveyed to Ross Foreman in a 2015 article, Sam said, "You can find my work on everything from t-shirts to murals to the concept and designs of restaurants. You can also find my work hanging on a wall in a gallery, or like today in a museum, or in the custom construction for one of my ad agency clients," close quote. So as we tried to highlight in the exhibition Axis Mundo, this type of fluidity and heterogeneity and the traffic between the commercial and the fine arts that artist Sam Kirk talks about is an asset and not a detriment to one's aesthetic practice and vision. Work with design by artist Jeff Warenke. Mundo Mesa himself worked on fashion and window displays with his partner Simon Doonan, and Teddy Sandoval all worked in commercial display work. And it was interesting when we visited, say, for instance, Teddy Sandoval's surviving partner, Paul, to look at his work, we came across a folder of his commercial design, and he kind of quickly pulled it away and said, "You don't want to see that, that's his commercial work." And I think that was because some of the other better known artists or well-known artists at the time in the 70s might have kind of chided him for participating in commercial work. And for David and I, the co-curators of Axis Mundo, that was exactly the type of work that we wanted to see and we wanted to highlight, was that kind of traffic between, that movement between the fine arts, the commercial work, and the fine arts and the activist work. So returning to the t-shirts, so we had a number of t-shirts in the exhibition, including one of the original Malflora t-shirts that's in the collection of the One Archives, which is the world's largest LGBTQ archives, a part of USC's library and the co-sponsor or host of the Axis Mundo exhibition. And then this is how that photograph that I showed you and the t-shirt itself were displayed in the exhibition. And I just want to show you some of the other ways in which, this is an image of Joey Terrell wearing the Maricon t-shirt that greeted viewers when they emerged up the staircase and entered the second floor of the MoCA Pacific Design Center space. And then that space became a backdrop itself for a number of selfies, including, the punk icon Alice Bagg, seen here on the left posing there, and, the incredibly handsome and dapper Joey Terrell posing, years later in front of the younger image of himself sporting the Maricon t-shirt. Laura Aguilar's photographs were also prominently featured in the exhibition, and you can see them here to the right of the Maricon. Laura's photography of the 80s and 90s records the vibrancy and the intersecting Chicana, Latina, immigrant, and queer communities in Los Angeles. And this is particularly poignant in the two series that were featured in Axis Mundo, her Latina lesbian series and the Plush Pony series that we see here. Whether photographing in their living room or in a no longer existing lesbian bar, Aguilar's portraits convey a powerful intimacy between the sitter and the photographer, and also in the case of group shots between the individuals photographed. For the Plush Pony series, Aguilar set up a makeshift studio in an East LA lesbian bar in the El Sereno neighborhood that was named the Plush Pony. And over the course of multiple visits, photographed dozens of regulars, couples, and groups. The resulting images display a range of butch femme couples, gay men, genderqueer bodies, and combinations thereof in groupings that enable the viewer to imagine the social texture and community at the time. And again, I want to kind of map out a correspondence to Diana Solis's photographs that also kind of have these incredibly poignant and intimate portraits of friends and couples alongside these larger groupings at pride parades and gay and lesbian rallies from the 70s and 90s. While preparing for this, I read a really great article by Hinda, I hope I may not be pronouncing this correctly, Hinda Saif, that was published in Diálogo, which is the journal that Professor Johnson Gonzalez edits in 2018, called Visualizing Spaces of Empowerment in Chicana Mexicana Chicago, with artist and cultural organizer Diana Solis, which I encourage you all to read. And Hinda here writes that when Solis photographed the growing lesbian community in the early 1980s, there were no formal spaces for women-loving Latinas. She took pictures of her friends in their homes and in lesbian bars outside of Latino neighborhoods, such as Maryland's Bar in River North. And then meanwhile, we can see in her Latina lesbian series that Aguilar is photographing individuals in the clothes and settings in which they felt most comfortable, and then invited each participant to provide a short personal narrative to accompany the image. Many share elements of their personal stories and aspirations, and often discuss the intersection of their multiple identifications and their sense of community. And I did want to share with you this photograph that I found on Instagram of the artist Laura Aguilar and her archivist and assistant Christopher Velasco and another friend posing in front of Aguilar's photographs in Axis Mundo. And this is a very touching and memorable image for me. Other examples of historical recovery in Axis Mundo include the photographs that you see here by Tosh Carrillo, who was known for his appearance in several films by Andy Warhol, and in also performances, other underground New York performances and theater productions from the late 1960s. And these photographs were all printed and exhibited for the first time in Axis Mundo. I had found them in an archive at the New York Public Library, where they were miscatalogued because the artist's name had been misspelled back in 2007, and they'd been waiting, years to find a way to finally present them. Likewise, lesser known works by celebrated artists such as Judy Baca and Carlos Almaraz were also exhibited. When we presented these slides to Judy Baca, she was like, "Where did you find these? I don't even have copies of these," which was kind of a stunning revelation. And so those lesser known works by well-known artists were exhibited alongside recently uncovered works by artists such as Jeff Werenke, in this painting that we found in his brother's home of their parents in their matching zoot suits, and also works by Judy Miranda and Gerardo Velasquez. In many cases, we were presenting works for the first time since their production, or work that hadn't been displayed publicly for 30 years, or that was being presented in a museum for the first time. As is the case for this stunning photograph by Judy Miranda called Chicas. that captures an intricate exchange of gazes between photographer and the couple depicted in the portrait. Looks charged with a sexy, flirtatious, and seductive energy. And this was found in the collection of the late art historian Schiffer Goldman in the archives at UC Santa Barbara, in the California Ethnic and Multicultural Archives there. And when I presented the image to the artist Judy Miranda, she was stunned to see it, and unfortunately didn't have a negative of it any longer or a print of it. So the exhibition photograph that we showed was actually a digital photograph of the photograph that I found in the archive. And these types of things became necessary throughout the exhibition, to kind of recreate works from sources that didn't exist any longer, or for originals that couldn't travel. And then one other incredibly powerful piece by Judy Miranda was found on a studio visit with the artist in Denver. She'd lived in Denver now for over 30 years, although she taught for many years in Los Angeles, exhibited in Los Angeles until the mid-'80s. In fact, she was one of Laura Aguilar's photography teachers at East LA College. So this was a work from the early 1980s that we found on the studio visit with Judy Miranda. In the 1980s, a close friend asked Miranda to shoot him as a gift for his partner shortly after learning he was HIV positive. Miranda would photograph 6 erogenous zones of his body and then individually frame them and arrange them in a form of a cross. And they had last been exhibited or shown at the subject's funeral. Miranda's installation celebrates sensuality and sexuality as life-affirming, worthy of remembrance long after one's passing. And this is something that I don't know this individual. I thank them immensely. It was a post I found on Instagram, and I can, on Miranda's photograph installation. And the Instagrammer writes, some museums, this is the biggest compliment I can ever share. Some museum exhibitions bring you to tears, and you go back to see the show multiple times, to read every label, to pore over the catalog, to mediate on every story, to contemplate each life lost. Axis Mundo is the most moving PST LA exhibition I've seen of the nearly 30 that I've made it to so far. So I just wanted to share that testimony with you. And throughout the organizing of the exhibition, we worked extensively with the artists. And when the artists were no longer with us, we worked with their families, with their surviving partners, with their friends, with their band members, and worked with them in their homes, in their garages, in their attics, in their storage units, uncovering and finding and asking, can we see more? Is there any more that we can see? And this is an example of a photographer, Anthony Friedkin, who photographed Mundo Mesa and Mundo's pal, Jim, also known as Jamie, in Montebello in 1972 and Anthony Friedkin is, a non-queer artist, a non-Chicano artist who worked on this photo essay called The Gay Essay that he started in the early 1970s. And he got to know and befriended Mundo and Jim at these gay funky dances, which were kind of all ages dances sponsored by the Gay Liberation Front, and where young people would go and hang out and meet one another. And Anthony met and was really taken by Mundo and Jim and their style, and so he photographed them for this photo essay that was then published in this early influential gay newspaper called gay underground newspaper called Gay Sunshine, published out of the Bay Area, a newspaper of gay liberation. And we reached out to Anthony Friedkin, and we knew this photograph of Mundo because it had been published, it had been exhibited previously. We also knew this photograph of Ciclona, that this is Anthony Friedkin in his home showing us a vintage print of that image of Ciclona, because that was also published in the gay essay in Gay Sunshine. But no one had ever asked Anthony for any of the additional photographs that he might have taken of Mundo, of Jim, and of others during this time. And so at the right, you can see, images that we found, additional images that he found. And here we have more of the kind of contact sheets and images of Jamie, who lived as a transgender person in East LA at this time and worked as a kind of shoe salesperson, I should say, at the local Sears. And then this is one of these photographs that had never been printed or published before of Mundo by Anthony that we published as kind of the front piece to the catalog and the cover of the exhibition itself, exhibition catalog itself. So I hope that can help to give you some insight into some of the motivations for the exhibition, some of the process that was involved and the methods involved in the kind of identification and recovery and presentation of this work. And I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation and taking some of your questions as well. Hi, Sam.
Hey, Ondine, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much to DePaul for inviting me to participate in this conversation. We had some interesting interruptions there. I think we might have had some Zoom bombs, although it felt a little bit like a dance party. So that's kind of perfect in alignment a little bit for our community.
Someone was dancing out there.
Right? I was like, oh, something's going on back there. You mentioned so much that I'm like, where do I begin? But one of the things that I appreciate that you shared is how queer artists have used so many different mediums to share their work. And I can't help but think about, what are the many reasons for this? And at the same time, I think about how in many ways, we're just starting to see like major main exhibitions about the queer experience in institutions, specifically in cultural institutions, like Laura Aguilar's solo show at the National Museum of Mexican Art. I'd never seen anything like that until, like a couple of years ago. And one, I can't help but think about, how being able to see work like that could shape some perspectives in our community. But I'm also curious to know if you had any challenges in exhibiting Axis Mundo, and if there's anything in specific that you ran into that prevented you from showing it with some art institutions.
No, that's a great question. I mean, there's always challenges with organizing exhibitions and presenting work. I think there were several challenges, as you can well imagine, and one of them was trying to find an institution to host it, right? To find a museum that would present it, that would take it on, and because the organizing institution was the one gallery. A part of the one archive, the world's largest LGBTQ archive, which is part of USC's University of Southern California. And they had a space, and a very small space, but not a large enough space that for the ambitious exhibition that we had envisioned. And so when we were initially looking for venues in Los Angeles, as well as beyond, one of the things that we would always confront was the expectation that our exhibition was going to be small. And so it was really like, don't you just want this little closet of a gallery?
Yeah.
And it was this kind of presumption amongst the curators and the museum directors that since they knew so few queer Chicanx artists, it's like, how could there be, right? And so we were always navigating this kind of presumption that our exhibition because it was taking, quote, a narrow approach, right? It was going to be a small exhibition. And as a result, when it was in Los Angeles and when it was in New York, the exhibition was split up between two separate venues because we couldn't get a venue large enough for our exhibition. And that posed challenges both in terms of the design and conceptualization of the show, but also for the audience, right? And in New York, when it was at Hunter College, it was like one was all the way downtown and one was all the way up Midtown. Like in LA, they were both in West Hollywood and one could walk, right? But we knew that the audience wouldn't necessarily make it to both. It wasn't until the exhibition was in Las Vegas at the Barrick Art Museum at the University of Las Vegas, where it was the first time that we were ever able to present the exhibition all together as we had conceived and conceptualized it. I should also say that while it was in Los Angeles, we had to, we sublet a, I'm embarrassed to even describe this. In it, we had the Mocha PDC space, which I showed you the exterior of, and then we sublet a commercial art gallery, actually a kind of Persian art gallery on Melrose Avenue. And the landlord that we were subletting from got evicted from the building, which we had to shut down the exhibition within 24 hours.
Oh my gosh.
Remove everything safely, get new loan agreements, and then find a new venue for the exhibition. So that's quite a challenge, I suppose. One of the other challenges of expectations that we had was, and again, talking to museum folk in the world where, you know, most of the museum directors and curators that we were talking to in Los Angeles in particular were not Latinx. The question we always got was, is Felix Gonzalez Torres in your exhibition?
Yeah.
It was like the one.
Oh no. Can everybody else hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, I think Ondine
lost the connection.
Oh, I think you're back.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, you were just getting ready to tell us. we just lost you for about a minute or so.
Oh, did I finish the Felix Gonzalez Torres thing?
You're just getting started just after you mentioned Felix Gonzalez Torres.
Oh, right. And you know, the irony was, is we would say, no, he's not in this exhibition, even if he's the only Latinx queer artist that you know, right? And what it ended up doing was it actually oftentimes would shut down the conversation, right? Which was always an obstacle, right? It was like when we would say, no, the one queer artist, the one queer Latinx artist that you know is not in the exhibition because he wasn't a part of this network. It didn't motivate other questions like, well, then who is in your show, right? It was like the conversation was over at that point with those museum folks.
Wow. You know, when you mentioned having to split up the show and to show in two different spaces, or even just to have to reduce the exhibition to a much smaller space, I can't help but think about like how challenging it might be to determine, you know, which pieces you then select and which content you share. And with my own personal work, I create quite a bit from a perspective of the community that the work is being shown in, especially as a public art. I always try to think of, you know, who might come into the room. So I'm curious to know, you know, when you're faced with a challenge like that and you're trying to show so much work that needs to be seen and shares a lot about our community, how do you go about in selecting, you know, which pieces to share?
As every curator will tell you, it's one of the, you know, in addition to having to fundraise, right? It's one of the biggest challenges because, you know, and we worked with one curator at Mocha whose kind of catchphrase was, you have to cut your darlings, be ready to cut your darlings. And So patronizing. You know, so it's incredibly difficult to make those selections, in particular because we didn't want to have an exhibition where, yes, there are some artists who are maybe only represented by one piece. When I thought the exhibition was the most dynamic was when you would see one artist reappear in multiple sections of the exhibition with different types of work, right? Or with a different series. So for instance, Laura Aguilar's photographs were spread out into 3 different parts of the exhibition. But I would say, you know, what made it a little bit easier to make those cuts, because eventually we did have to make cuts, was that we had an enormous catalog because of the largesse of the Getty funding. And so we always knew, right, that, and it's important, I think the catalogs are important, not just for the scholarship, that because exhibitions are ephemeral, right? They are necessarily ephemeral. The catalogs live on, and the catalogs have, from my perspective, a greater impact in terms of kind of moving and changing, you know, the canon and opening up new scholarship and, you know, for its use in the classroom and for people who can never have seen the exhibition in the first place to maybe potentially come across the book. And so we always knew that we had, you know, we could always show double, if not sometimes 3 times as many things in the catalog than we could in the exhibition. So that helped.
Okay. You know, you brought up Laura Aguilar's work, not only in your presentation, but just now. And I remember viewing her exhibition, and it was beautiful because there's so many photographs on community, but then also so many photographs on herself and her identity. And some of those pictures, a lot of people might feel were too provocative or too much. And sometimes I feel like that's thought of because we know she's a queer artist, specifically with institutions that are within the Latinx community. And I'm curious to know, you know, in sharing this body of work and also other exhibitions, have you run into issues in dealing with the curators around showing work that is very outwardly queer? And, you know, have you had any issues with that?
You know, I have to say with all of the institutions that we ended up working with, no, right, fully. Because I think it was a risk and a challenge for them, right? And I should say most of the venues that we showed at were university or college art galleries and museums. And I think they serve a vital importance. So it's about what are the curricular connections, right? And how will it serve our campus community as well as the kind of, you know, urban or rural communities that we also serve. And I know that some of these institutions, museum directors and curators took on the exhibition with some risk, right? I mean, I can say that for at least one of the venues, the local school district called and said, we're not going to be able to bring our schools to, you know, our public school to the museum this semester because of the content of this exhibition. And there's something that's heartbreaking about that, right? Because for some of these school children, this might have been their only art venue or access to an art museum, you know, that whole year. And I think that put a little bit of a chill factor in for that museum director, you know, kind of like what may be on the horizon.
Yeah.
But they braved it, and you know, school groups did go and see the exhibition, thankfully, you know, but you know, there were some that could not, that were not allowed.
I see.
If that's okay with you, Sam and Ondine, thank you so much for both of you. We have so many questions in the chat. So if that's okay with you, we're going to start. And there's questions for both Ondine and Sam. The first question is from Brad Hoot. The question says, Ondine, you mentioned parallels between, for instance, LA and Denver, based Aguilar, for example, and also Chicago-based artist Diana Solis. Could you please talk a bit more about the connections, if any, that existed between the LA artistic community you profiled and Chicago?
Sure. I need to clarify. So I wasn't suggesting that there was a parallel between Denver and Los Angeles, but rather that that specific artist, Judy Miranda, had lived for many years in Los Angeles and worked in Los Angeles, and the work that we showed was produced in Los Angeles, but has been living in Denver for over 30 years since, right? So it was more like, you know, artists travel. And so, and many of the artists that once lived and worked in LA that we showed no longer live in LA. And so we would go to where they were, where their materials were. In terms of the Chicago connections, an artist like, you know, Carlos Almaraz was kind of lived in Chicago. There are, you know, a kind of, there is movement, you know, between, you know, migration patterns between LA and Chicago. And I think the one thing that when I was reading about Diana Solis's work, and in some ways also one of Sam's initial questions for me was about, you know, what's specific about Los Angeles and what's kind of different about the geographies as we traveled around. And one of the things I would say is that we were very specific about Los Angeles in a way that, I'm going to sound like an asshole, but you know, like New York curators don't have to say that they're doing a show about New York. It could just be whatever it is, right? And then it like comes by default, like the national, where like, you know, when you're outside of New York, you have to specify, I feel, what region you are. But what we tried to do in the exhibition is to provide a model for what any city could do, right? That these queer histories and queer Latinx histories are there. Wherever there's a community and a history of Latinx art, there is also a community of queer Latinx art, right? And it goes back, it just needs to be recovered, right? And it needs to be collected and presented. And it has to be done so before it starts to disappear and disintegrate, right? Because it hasn't been collected, it hasn't been cared for. And one thing that Brad, in trying to get more specific to your question, the connection that became very clear to me when I read about Diana Solis's work is this idea about claiming space, right? And that how Latinxes, immigrants, and Latinas have needed space, found and lost space, claimed space, and built and created space. And this was happening in Chicago, and it's documented in Diana Solis's work. And this is also part of the story that we're trying to tell in Axis Mundo. And I think that these stories are there in every major city across the United States where there has been a vibrant Latinx art scene. Christopher Garcia.
There's another question from Evelyn Flores. And the question says, before you started the exhibition and began your studies of queer Chicanx art, what kind of assumptions did you have?
I don't know how to answer that question because I think my interest and entree into art history, and Delia Constantino and I, who went to undergraduate school together, she can speak to this as well. We're kind of always in that realm of and my early art history, my interest in early kind of Chicanx art history came from, I was an intern at the San Jose Museum of Art while an undergrad at UC Santa Cruz. And one of the curators said, we're going to be doing an exhibition with an artist named Gronk, and we want someone to do an interview with him. And we think you would be the perfect person to interview him. I thought, okay, cool. that's a great name, Gronk. And so I get on the phone and, my introduction to Chicano, Chicanx art history is from a queer Chicano artist. And he's talking to me about Osco, who several years later, I'm co-organizing their retrospective exhibition. But so my intro to the field was through this kind of queer history, although it wasn't able to be the focus or the locus for my kind of exhibition work and scholarship until more recently. It became a greater focus, if that helps.
The next question is for Sam from Kate Dibus, and it says, do you have a piece of work you've done that resonates with you the most in relation to how your identity, whether that be sexuality or gender?
Yeah, actually, I'd say most of my work in some way, shape, or form relates to me. Just because I'm always looking for how our journey in life and some of the experiences that we have in life impacts ultimately who we become. And whether I'm navigating that, with somebody else or not, the interest comes from my personal experience as a queer person and understanding how my life experiences has helped me to develop who I am, or also slowed me down in developing some parts of who I am. So pretty much all of my work has to do with that.
Thank you. The next question is from Daniel Quiles, and it says, hello, Ondine. I just want to thank you for this powerful and necessary exhibition. I wanted to ask about your effective investment as a curator when choosing and organizing this material. I love what you say about artist networks being porous, multimedia, and multi-community. Would you say that they are also to some degree speculative as well? This would add importance and creativity to your role as temporary caretaker for the work and artist legacies.
Oh, yes, what a great question. And they are certainly speculative, right? In some ways, we wanted to kind of, map or do a Venn diagram of the different networks and constellations, if you will, of the different associations and relationships. And they were so inspiring.
We'll give it another minute and see if...
Oh, I may have frozen.
Yes, but you're back.
Oh, sorry. And another instances like the artist Pauline Oliveiros, who's probably one of the better known artists in the exhibition. It was reading in an archive about, Dick Higgins, the kind of Fluxus performer, kind of Dick Higgins wanting to restage one of his plays called Stack Deck, and he wanted Pauline to redo the music for that performance. And he'd also cast Alan Capro and the artist Jerry Driva, who was a member of Les Petites Bonbons. And so all of a sudden, and it never happened. The performance never happened. It was just the casting and the correspondence that brought Pauline Oliveiros together with Jerry Driva that connects to Osco and the other artists. So it's totally speculative in a way that I found, both necessary for improvisation and also kind of a quick shift in response. Then, but I use that as my entree to ask Pauline about her work with Dick and with other artists. And she was like, I have all this material on that if you'd like to see it. And I was like, absolutely. You're very kind also to ask about my the effective work of being a curator. And I can say that there was a tremendous amount, as you can well imagine, of emotional labor, right? As well as intellectual labor and curatorial labor, as well as registrarial labor. The emotional labor involved in working with the caretakers of this work, right? Of the legacy of these artists, in particular when the artist had passed, right? And you were, with someone's partner or mother or sibling or best friend who had been holding on to these materials, right? For 30 years or more, 20 years, 30 years or more, and going through them with them. And oftentimes, because you know, these artists have not been a part of collections, have not generally been exhibited previously, you know, they would say, you're the first person to ever come and ask about so-and-so, right? But there was also some hesitancy, fear, concern, and suspicion, right? In particular about museums and and what are you going to do with this work and how are you going to care for it? And that's actually where I can say also that it was very helpful that David and I had both done previous exhibitions with substantial catalogs, and we were able to present to individuals, say, you know, this is the OSCO catalog, you know, this is the Cruising the Archive catalog. We would like to do something of this scale and, you know, include your loved one's work in it as well. And so that it will have this type of framing and import and hopefully legacy. But the emotional labor, you know, I still get emotional in surprising ways when I think about the exhibition and the experience of putting it to the years of experience putting it together, as well as traveling with it.
The next question is from Nikolai Duke-Robayo, and the question is about the splitting the show into locations. And the question is, was there a curatorial thread that connected these half shows? From an outreach perspective, I am intrigued on the idea of the ways that a half story can leave an open-endedness that, when done right, can be inciting and thought-provoking.
Oh, well, that's very generous. And I think we did our best. You know, the exhibition was divided into sections. And so we you know, were able to kind of float the different sections, although they changed and they would change and get reconfigured in each space or each series of spaces. And we were also working with things, for instance, the curator at MoCA told us that they didn't like lots of vitrines and archival work, right, or ephemera. And our show is filled with vitrines and ephemera, as well as large scale paintings and installations. And so those were also sometimes things that we would have to consider. But we did curatorially and conceptually try to create each one as kind of a complete unit in of itself, that if our thought was that if an audience member only was able to see one, that they might get enough, but also be intrigued enough that they might want to learn more about, you know, some of the artists and the time period depicted in the exhibition, but not feel that they have to see the second part.
Thank you. Now for Sam, they ask, where can they find your work and how can we support your work? And where can they see it on display? So I'm gonna let you respond to that.
Well, thank you. First, you could see it at the DePaul Museum currently. There's a piece there, but I have a fine art practice and public art practice, so I have quite a few murals in Chicago. But you can always check my website, iamsamkirk.com, to learn more about different exhibitions and spaces where you can find my work. Thank you.
You can even find it in Morocco, right?
Yes, even in Morocco.
So the next question is for Ondine from Rafael Soldi, and it says, can you speak to some of the challenges and opportunities and the responsibility that comes with curating a large show that is the first of its kind? These shows tend to hold a place in history and are often referenced, criticized, or revered.
Right. I guess it sounds more burdensome than it felt at the time. You know, there's something that's daunting and frustrating about doing something that's a first. Right, that this was the first historical exhibition on this topic. It wasn't the first exhibition of Chicanx queer art, right? There had been exhibitions previously, and we charted some of those in our exhibition. I think what we really tried to do, and I hope we did reasonably and well and responsibly, is that we assembled an amazing team and an amazing intergenerational team of scholars, and we really were kind of committed to the research and the process. And it doesn't mean that we finished every thread, right, or followed every breadcrumb. There's still lots more that we're still, David and I still continue to curate and, you know, continue to produce scholarship. And so we didn't finish up everything, thankfully, but we really were committed to trying to create the most visually rewarding exhibition that we could, that would serve the artists and their legacies, and to have a catalog that would not close the chapter, but open the narratives and open the subject up for further scrutiny, scholarship, analysis, and interpretation, and presentation, and collection, right, into other museum collections as well.
So this is more of a comment, but Hinda says Diana Solis is in Zoom, so that's great. And hi, Diana. And also Hinda says that Diana Solis became friends with Laura Aguilar, and Hinda is writing a book on Diana with Nicole Marroquin. So that is, and Nicole is also here. So another question from Billy Johnson Gonzalez says, could Ondine speak a bit about artist training? Did people get into art as activists doing photography or have formal art training? What is the path by which they became artists, and do they have to navigate exclusion from art schools and create their own mentoring networks?
That's such a great question. And there are all kinds of different routes that these artists took. A number of them were kind of DIY kind of trained. But one of the things that we found through the research was that there was a really interesting pipeline that went from Cal State University Long Beach, which was known for its printmaking program. It actually had like the largest printmaking facility west of the Mississippi. And because of the connection between printmaking at the time in the late 60s and early 70s with social activism and social justice work, right? So there, at the same time that Long Beach was one of the first institutions in Southern California to implement Chicano studies, and they had a major kind of Chicano recruitment program going on. And so a lot of young Chicanitos and Chicanitas, right, including people like Judy Miranda and Teddy Sandoval and Roberto Gildemontes, all ended up at Long Beach. And with the internet today. Sorry, I froze for a minute again.
You were telling us that they all ended up at Long Beach.
Right, and Long Beach, and then there was a pipeline from Long Beach to the Otis College of Art and Design, which has been, you know, which has a long legacy for Chicana and Chicano artists and Latinx artists in Los Angeles. So that was a pipeline and a very effective one. The other thing that we see is that there's a very ebullient period where there's a lot of students, many, like that painting of Jeff Warenke of my parents in their matching zoot suits. That was a piece he made while he was an undergraduate student, right? And so there's a lot of kind of this youthful, ebullient energy among young students. They're exhibiting and they're on their campuses. They're organizing like Cinco de Mayo exhibitions or Dia de la Raza exhibitions. OSCO has their first exhibition at Cal State Long Beach, right? One of the, you know, outside of East LA. So there's a whole lot of activity happening where the students are organizing exhibitions. They're, you know, networking with their friends, providing these opportunities. And then that starts to also impact the kind of not-for-profit alternative art spaces in LA. And then something happens around 1976, 1977, after there are some early major exhibitions, statewide exhibitions focused on Chicano art. Soon after that, the opportunities for exhibition close down. The alternative art spaces also begin to close down. And it seems that there's a number of artists, some in the exhibition, who shift gears. And some of them move away from art, or they move away from the more experimental or the conceptual art making that they were involved in previously. So, I mean, there's a lot more to uncover there, but there are some fascinating histories there that we were surprised by.
So that's, I think, a wonderful question and answer to conclude today's program. Although there's one last question, and maybe that's not for Ondine or Sam. Maybe either Nicole or Diana want to answer this last question, which I think would be also a nice way to end. And the question is from Colectivo Multipolar that says, is Diana Solis' work in an archive? How can we support her practice? So I do really love ending with this question. And I don't know if Nicole or Diana, do you want to unmute yourselves and respond?
I think we both can respond.
Yes, please. Hi.
Can you hear me? At the time, actually, a very, very tiny percentage of the work that Nicole has recovered, or that we both have recovered of my archives, is at University of Illinois in the Latin American Studies department, very tiny, like a little small box. But in reality, right now, we spent, and including with Hinda, we spent about 3 years now, and Nicole can correct me because she's the one that has really gained intimate knowledge of my work over the past 3 years, that we are in a process right now of categorizing and archiving work in a way that's more professional, and that it's not yet at an archive, but will be coming soon, I think. Maybe not this year. I am still using and working with a lot of the work, especially because I have returned to photography as recently as last year. But Nicole can talk a little more, just a little more about it.
I'm so excited by this whole discussion. I'm actually teaching a class at SAIC right now. And I think a couple of students are in the class too. And we're doing the work, working with Latitude to actually digitize and make print quality scans of Diana's work. It's like an absolute honor to be able to, but we're talking 7,000 minimum, and I know I don't have them all.
Plus.
Yeah. But it's also really crucial to me that young artists in who are working now actually get a look at this work and talk about the significance, right? Be part of this sort of thinking about the selecting of, and talk about the meaning of the work to them, right? And so, yeah, it's like the most exciting thing in the world. The class is called Activating a Queer Chicago Archive, and through the work of Diana Solis. And yeah, we're only a couple of weeks in, but I was just thrilled to hear you talking about the work, about her work, and I can't wait to see what happens next. It should be visible, but we're taking it step by step here. We're really putting in the work to make sure it's presented properly.
I'm so thrilled to hear that, and I can just say that the archival collection and preservation and the accessibility is absolutely fundamental, and it's in particular with this history that we document in this exhibition, when museums were not collecting, and they weren't, right? Previously, it was university archives that were collecting like Latinx and Chicanx art, and although it was not our goal for David and I to make Axis Mundo a kind of collecting initiative, through the process of organizing the exhibition and developing the relationships with the artists and the family members or the caretakers, a number of the archival collections that we originally consulted in people's homes have since become a part of the official One archive. And these include collections by Jerry Allen, Jack Vargas, Gerardo Velasquez, Roberto Hildemontes, Ray Navarro. So they're now all been kind of, and are now processed and available for future research and scholarship. And so it's just, I think it's one of the kind of key, it's key to making these histories accessible, available, and presentable in the future. So,
well, here it is. I just want you to see it's right there. Yeah, just the real thing. There it is.
Thank you.
I would love to ask another question from the chat, the last one, I promise, but I do think is important. And Belinda says, any words of advice for queer, Latina, Latinx artists? This is the first space I have been where I feel open to ask this. So thank you for navigating this conversation. So either for Sam, Ondine, but also maybe anyone in the audience that.
Ondine, you want to start? Or?
I just say keep working, right? And find ways to show that work and share that work, and it's like the Oscar artists always said, like they weren't going to wait for anyone to give them a show, right? They like made their own opportunities possible, right? And they did that through their collaborations and through their friendship and trust with one another and support of one another. So I think that's, get your crew together, right? Get your crew together and keep making the work and make good, smart work, and then share it with us all, because we need to see it.
I would say, and thank you, I agree with you, Ondine. I would say, try to make connections with other queer artists that are out there. I'm so happy that Diana Solis is on the call, because Ondine and I spoke about her before this chat. I've had the great pleasure of, getting to know her over the years, and whether she knows this or not, she'll know it now. Having her in my life in some realm was a support that, I'm getting emotional even thinking about it. It was supportive to see somebody who has lived so many years and has done so much with her work, and to just be able to go to her and ask her questions when I, needed to ask questions, was extremely valuable. And for me, having queer artists that I can talk to and connect with, even knowing how difficult it is for us to show our work and to have our work recognized, just having that connection and to be able to see everything that they've done, I think is just really, really powerful, and is really supportive in its own way.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you both, Ondine and Sam, and everyone really that joined us for your fantastic questions and comments. It has been a real pleasure and very touching evening today. So I hope you have a good rest of your evening, and thank you again so much for joining.